Good afternoon. My name is Merritt Hughes. I'm a Specialist Master and a FinOps certified professional here at Deloitte Consulting. I focus on helping our state, local, and federal clients optimize their cloud spend and derive the maximum benefit for the taxpayer dollar. Before we dive into the depths of commitment management, I want to set the background on how cloud computing has changed from a cost management perspective today from the on-premises world of yesterday. Originally, agencies made a direct commitment to the server manufacturers by pre-purchasing their expected server consumption for the next 3 to 5 years. They didn't know exactly what they would need and if they would have the funding when the future need arose. This meant that large quantities of servers were purchased and then sat in a data center, used or not, for an extended period. With the move to the cloud, servers could be acquired and returned at any time for any reason with no commitment beyond the actual running time of the servers, and this converted the bulk of the infrastructure costs from a capital expense to an operating expense. This change provided immense flexibility from a technical point of view, but potentially comes with a higher computing cost if all virtual machines and databases run on a 24/7 on-demand basis. And this is where cloud commitments like reserved instances, savings plans, and committed use discounts come in. By the user committing to a certain amount of consumption, the cloud service providers can offer the organization a lower usage rate for compute and database machines. But before we go any further, let's define what exactly are commitments. At a high level, a commitment is the purchaser guaranteeing to the cloud provider that they will use a particular type of resource or group of resources for an extended period, 12 or 36 months, in exchange for a lower hourly effective rate. With few exceptions, these are solely a financial construct and do not have a direct technical impact. For example, a 1-year reserved instance from AWS or Azure is a commitment for 8,760 consecutive hours of an exact configuration of virtual machine or database, including region, operating system, type, and size, in exchange for discounts that can be as high as 43%. Extend that commitment for 3 years, and that discount can increase to as high as 72%. A savings plan, similar to a reserved instance, is an agreement to use compute resources but without being tied to a specific configuration, as the commitment is made in dollars per hour rather than to specific usage. For AWS, there are 2 types with higher discounts for lower flexibility. This provides a lot more flexibility to allow agencies to modernize or right-size their cloud environment without risking that a commitment would be wasted. There are some caveats to how these commitments will apply to the corresponding on-demand consumption. The cloud provider chooses which resource will receive the discount, and it will vary based on if the commitments are purchased at an account or subscription level versus at the payer or enterprise level. Google's resource-based committed use discounts is similar in principle to AWS and Azure's reserved instances, and they can only be executed at the project level and can be selected with or without guaranteed capacity commitment for corresponding change in offered discount. Google's flexible committed use discounts are functionally similar to a savings plan where the commitment is tied to the hourly spend. These are only executable at the billing level and would spread across projects. Spot or preemptible instances are sometimes mentioned in the same breath as reservations, as they are an effective way to reduce compute costs. However, they're the exact opposite of a commitment. For preemptible instances, the cloud provider issues a discounted rate to utilize their idle resources, but can terminate your workload with less than 2 minutes notice if the resource is needed at a higher price elsewhere. Now that I've laid out the foundation on what commitments are or are not, we need to discuss the key factors to consider before executing a single commitment. First, discover which of the numerous laws, regulations, guidelines, and policies that agencies are subject may govern your cloud commitment purchases. State, local, and federal governments all have different restrictions on how they can fund and procure items, both tangible and intangible, including cloud resources and cloud commitments. Just like we often do with our personal budgets, it's easy to fall into the mindset of, I have the money right now to buy this discount, or even the, if I don't buy this now, I won't have the money later. This approach would ignore the fact that commitment purchases may be subject to more constraints than just the amount of the funding available. Depending on the laws and regulations to which your agency is subject, there could be legal consequences that far outweigh any benefit derived from the commitment discount. For federal agencies, the Anti-Deficiency Act has potential implications on all 3-year commitments and some 1-year commitments. The Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits federal government from obligating or expending federal funds in advance of or in excess of an appropriation. In addition, it prohibits involving the government in any obligation to pay money before funds have been appropriated for that purpose unless otherwise allowed by law. What does this mean with regards to commitments? As I mentioned earlier, cloud commitments are made for 1 or 3-year timeframes. Many federal agencies are funded for a maximum of 1 year at a time. In fact, often funding is issued incrementally, making even 1-year commitments a challenge to execute while remaining compliant with the Anti-Deficiency Act. Purchasing a commitment midway through your contract year, even if it is fully funded, is of concern. That commitment would extend beyond what is appropriated by Congress. And of course, some exceptions do apply. For example, doing the advanced work to get 3-year funding in place would allow for longer-term commitments without risking a violation of ADA. Federal agencies that are self or grant funded may have additional flexibility as their funds are not part of the appropriations process. To help mitigate this risk, some value-added resellers will absorb the risk of the longer terms and allow the government to only commit to the funded period. All of that to say, federal agencies do have mechanisms to execute 1- and 3-year commitments, but it requires a lot of due diligence to ensure that all factors are considered. For state and local agencies, there's no overarching guidance equivalent to the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act. The individuality of each state and locality means that there are unique guidelines around purchasing items that could apply to future fiscal years or extend past the contract end date. In general, states do have a bit more flexibility in how they fund contracts, often funding 2 to 5 years at a time. So consult your local contracts and procurement offices prior to making any reserved instance, savings plan, or committed use discount purchases. If this is the case in your state or locality, you will likely have an easier time getting those larger discounts for those longer commitments. Higher education institutions live in a hybrid world. Most state university systems are subject to their state limitations, whereas private universities operate under their own unique set of rules. However, regardless of private or public university, if your institution has researchers using federal grants to pay for their cloud consumption, it is important to verify what restrictions there may or may not be for what time periods that funding can cover. For example, if it is a 1-year grant, but the clock started 3 months ago, a commitment that is purchased today would extend 3 months past the grant. Once you have verified which, if any, federal, state, or local laws or regulations impact your ability to execute the commitment, what's next? First, you need to understand your current cloud purchasing contract. What is the period of performance? How much funding is remaining on contract? And how does it intersect with the regulations that apply to your agency? Does your cloud go through a reseller or a cloud broker? Do they have any restrictions on how RIs or savings plans can be procured? Does your contracting officer need to approve? For AWS users, also consider, is there a private pricing agreement that has a minimum spend requirement that needs to be met? Now that you've determined that purchasing commitments is in line with existing contractual and regulatory guidelines, it's time to start the work of determining what type and what amount of commitments are needed. The first step of this is to determine the stakeholders who will have inputs on what the technical landscape looks like currently and what it will look like over the next 12 to 36 months. These personas include your technical teams, any systems integrators or contracting staff that make up the architecture and development team, any programs or project leaders for cloud development or migration, and if applicable, your cloud reseller or broker. And of course, don't forget your new friends in the contracting and procurement offices. Starting with the technical teams, identify if there are any resources that are currently scheduled for deprecation or modernization. This includes modernizing from an older instance type to a newer one, or changing operating systems, such as going from a bring your own license model to a virtual machine with the embedded license. Determine what opportunities there are for right-sizing, over-provisioned, or deleting idle instances, and the timeline for making those changes. All of these pieces of information will give you the grains of salt you will need to add to the commitment recommendations that cloud providers display in their console regarding how much commitment to buy. Next up, talk to the program or project leads. And if you are a research-heavy institution, make sure you talk to your key researchers. You need to understand what projects are on the roadmap for the commitment period and to understand what may be temporarily driving the existing cloud spend or will impact future spend. Such as, is there a cyclical or one-time peak workload occurring now? For example, open enrollment for healthcare is happening now, but in February, usage rates will drop. This is similar if there are monthly or quarterly reporting or data processing that generates a brief expansion of the cloud footprint before contracting once the cycle is completed. Commitment purchases made to cover the periodically high spend would leave much of that commitment wasted for the baseline levels that prevail the remainder of the year. In addition to the current workload consumption patterns, it's important to understand what new workloads, even if short-term, will be coming to the cloud. For example, is a scientist planning on launching a new genomic study at the start of next year? Or will there be an advertising campaign to drive more taxpayers to file electronically, so the systems will need to scale up? Knowing what new workloads will be moving into the cloud during the commitment period will help clarify the risk of ending up with too much commitment. For all of these conversations, there will need to be a clear understanding of the compute and database consumption changes that will result from the shifting workloads. Hand-waving? Not an answer. For example, an activity that drives more users to look at a website may increase data transfer costs but have little to no effect on the amount of virtual machines being used. Or if millions of users start hitting the site, such as voter information sites over the next few weeks, there may be a need for a large increase in computing power. A right-sizing effort could reduce 5 instances from 16 core to 8 core, or it could be 50 instances. Make every effort to get concrete estimates of usage for any expected changes ahead of time. It may not be perfect and plans will change, but it will be better than guessing what was meant when it was announced that next week they were going to clean it all up. Understanding what more or less means in the context of your cloud is critical. And it may sound obvious, but also confirm in which cloud these activities will be taking place. It would be a shame to take into account planned activities in AWS, but while you're calculating Azure savings plan purchases, simply because it was assumed that all parties knew which cloud was being discussed. With a clear understanding of what the technical plans are from both an engineering and programs perspective, it is time to start looking at the real math of commitments. This means how many are currently in place. When do they expire exactly, particularly with regards to your contract vehicles? And what types of commitments are they? Are they reserved instances or are they savings plans? Are these commitments laddered over time, similar to a certificates of deposit? In fact, CD-styled ladders are the leading way to mitigate the risk of overcommitment. For most, quarterly reviews for purchasing and renewing commitments is that sweet spot for ladder length after the first year. Every 3 months, there is an opportunity to decrease the amount of commitment in the event that there is an unplanned deprecation or modernization effort. If there are no prior commitment purchases, it's tempting to buy full coverage all at once to get the immediate and maximum savings. But looking forward and spreading those purchases out over the year, perhaps 50% today, 20% in 3 months, another 20% 3 months after that, and making that fourth quarter payment the remaining 10% allows for a blend of immediate cost savings while mitigating risk. For some government agencies, these ladders are a violation of regulations such as the Anti-Deficiency Act or equivalent state laws. But if you can use a ladder, please do. If a ladder is not an option for legal or perception reasons, it's important to make sure that the annual big purchase is as accurate as possible, as there is no ability to reduce that commitment for 12 months. Next up, it is important to be certain of the type of the commitment most appropriate for the particular demands of the agency's cloud roadmap. For example, AWS and Azure savings plans and Google's flexible committed use are the most flexible to account for changing compositions of the cloud, which is great for agile environments or ones with a constant influx of migrations that change the cloud landscape. These flexible commitments do not provide the deeper discounts that come with the more restrictive reserved instances, but that trade-off is often worth it. If there's a high degree of confidence that the resource profiles will not change over the term, a reserved instance's higher discounts may be the better choice. There are pros to cons to both, and it's important to understand how those trade-offs will impact everything from the rate charged by the cloud provider to your chargeback to the program teams. The details of how these commitments could affect chargeback outputs is not in scope for today, but work with your FinOps team or cloud provider to ensure the impacts are understood prior to purchasing. Now, how to get started on calculating the ideal amount of commitment to buy, particularly if there's only one chance per year. A good first place to start is looking at the recommendations the cloud provider makes in their console for what level of commitment they suggest. Sometimes, if the cloud environment is stable and there are no major plans for right-sizing or modernization on the horizon, the provider recommendations may be 95% of the information you need. But keep in mind the cloud provider is lacking context outside of what is running currently in the cloud. They were not in your stakeholder sessions. Now determine the risk of downsizing over the next 12 months, if payment will be made up front or incrementally, if there is sufficient funding available, and if a reseller or cloud breaker is involved, do they need to be part of executing the commitment purchase? More on that in a minute. However, for most agencies and institutions, there isn't a steady state cloud that is not anticipating any changes over the next year. Instead, it is a cloud with a lot of different users doing various activities which may stop or start at any time. And this is when a deep dive into the existing billing data needs to be matched up with what was learned from the stakeholder sessions. For example, if the day the cloud commitment recommendations are reviewed happens to be the final week of fiscal year-end processing, with auto-scaling in full swing, those recommendations would likely be way too high. This means comparing existing consumption rates against non-peak workloads and adjusting the purchase recommendations down. If the usage has been fairly steady, but the technical team mentioned that they would be reducing server count by 50 over the next 2 to 3 months as they completed a modernization effort to serverless, or perhaps it's the opposite. This week is the lowest spend that is being predicted for the next 12 months, and in fact, a huge new workload is supposed to be launched next month. And if as a federal agency whose cloud contract is to be fully funded next week, the time to buy commitments with lowest risk of violating ADA is the day the contract award is made. So it may be worth it purchasing excess commitments if the ROI shows that if the new workloads are provisioned within the next 3 months, the taxpayer will likely still come out ahead. After adjusting the CSP recommendations to account for the projected futures of the cloud landscape, there are a few more boxes to check off before logging into your console and buying the commitment. First, what payment type, upfront or incremental, and term, 1 or 3 years, is appropriate. As mentioned earlier, AWS, Azure, and Google all offer 1 or 3 year options for their commitments. Unfortunately, for most federal users, their commitment options are limited to 1 year. But for state, local, and higher education institutions, if there are no other constraints, 3-year commitments should be strongly considered. Now that there's a time period, it's time to determine a payment method. For AWS, there are 3 choices for all: partial or no upfront payments for EC2. Azure offers an all or no upfront purchase, while Google only offers a no upfront payment method. For AWS and Azure, an all upfront payment brings a slightly higher discount, but oftentimes that additional 3 to 5% discount may not be worth the upfront large cash payment, particularly if there's a short-term funding crunch. However, if every penny counts because the funding problem is ongoing, those additional points of discounts can be worth the larger upfront payment. At this point, it probably feels like there is no other information that could possibly be needed before making the purchase of your commitment discounts. Stakeholders have been consulted, regulations and laws have been considered, math has been calculated. What more can there be? Is it really a government agency if there isn't an approval process? First, take the findings back to your stakeholders, preferably in a single meeting. Present the story of the current state, the future state, and the math. Ask for feedback. Ask for concerns. Ask someone to double check the math. I'd really hate for a sticky keyboard to lead to $1 million commitment when all that was needed was $10,000. Once there is concurrence, it's time to go through whatever the formal approval process is, probably a ServiceNow or Jira ticket. And if there isn't one, consider creating one. If there is a formal approval process, go ahead, dot the I's, cross the T's. And with that, your commitment journey is almost done. Now it is time to execute the actual commitment in the console, or CLI if you're fancy. This may involve working with someone who has the IAM privileges to execute the commitment purchase, or it may involve working with a cloud reseller or a cloud broker. Ensure that the commitments are bought so that they will apply as intended by confirming if they need to be bought at the account, project, or subscription level, or if instead they can be purchased at the billing or enterprise level. And then push OK, buy that commitment, and take a sigh of relief knowing that you have done all of the good work and are bringing value to your taxpayer. Now go update your cloud spend forecast to reflect the projected savings and have a good night. You didn't think we were done, did you? Sorry, but the work of commitments is never done. You will need to monitor over the next few days to weeks that the amount of the commitment purchased is sufficient and applying as expected. If you discover an error in the purchase of your commitment, the best course of action is to immediately reach out to the cloud provider support team with information about the error made and what is needed to correct it. The longer it goes between buying the commitment and getting the help fixing it, the harder it is to get resolution. If it is too long from purchase, there may be no refund available and your cloud budget will take the hit. Once the commitments are confirmed to be correct, it's time to take a deep breath, go for a walk. Soon enough, this process will start over again, anywhere from 2 to 11 months from now, when it's time to prepare to buy the next round of commitments. This has been a fairly high-level overview of the work that goes into determining how much commitment to buy. The math part is critical, but it is too specific to the particular cloud and even cloud service to be able to give direct guidance in this talk. Besides, who takes away real math from a webinar? Instead, I'd like you to take away the importance of knowing which laws and regulations apply to your purchasing commitments in your agency, and the importance of working across teams to get all of the information needed to put into that Excel spreadsheet. Thank you for joining me today, and we look forward to getting your questions next.